Afternoon? Yes. I don't know what I am. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk on African history in Yorkshire. My name is Joe Williams, and I run a project called Heritage Corner, Leeds. Okay, so the information's up there. I'll let that sink in a little. And it's not about quantity, it's about quality, isn't it? So it's in terms of the numbers here right now, and hopefully you'll find it inspiring. Okay, here we go. Didn't want to really begin without you, so I was really slowing it down. Okay, so the time it's 12:10 now, and so lunch is at 1:30. So if we leave about 15 minutes, 20 minutes for Q&A, perhaps. So, okay, because I can talk for England, so I will put the timer on, which will tell me when to stop. Hopefully. Okay, it's getting that balance between keeping the phone off and having the timer on and hearing it. Right, okay. So here we are in Black History Month, and I think we've reached quite a turning point here in Britain as we face or embrace, I should say, more the history of Africans in Yorkshire. And it's been the missing link, you might say, because we know a little of African history, African Caribbean history we know a little of, but mostly African American. And what's been totally missing is history related to here. And a lot of people are like, what history in England? And of course it's very poignant at this time in the nation's kind of crossroads, you might say. Which direction is it going in? And in terms of Brexit, a lot of that has to do with nationhood and identity. And if we look at the colonial legacies, that has helped to form that identity, that aspect of the narrative has largely been one-sided. And there is much more to appreciate. But I think you're going to find some of this interesting. So 30 years ago, I began my research effectively when I was doing development work at the West Yorkshire Playhouse, and I think we met around that time in the 90s, I think. But my research had begun in the 80s. I trained as an actor in London, and then after many years doing theatre in education, taking theatre into schools, I wanted to be more representative of a more positive heritage and history, instead of having to audition for Crime Watch and other such programs. It trust me, it gets on your nerves after a while. You need the money, but it's like, And so I thought I'd do community theatre, and I thought that way I would learn. So I started a theatre company called Kufdom in the 1980s, and that was fantastic. We did amazing community productions, and in our first Christmas show, we had over half a dozen pairs of mothers and daughters in the community show. And when you're doing drama workshops with mothers and daughters in the workshop, kind of making fools of themselves, it's just such an awesome, but it was such a good community. It was great at bringing people together and bringing the community together. But I was still stuck for positive references, because as West Indians, we knew just so little about our history. And I was very fortunate while doing development work at West Yorkshire Playhouse, a lot of that was voluntary. I met with some historians, local historians. Two of them had been published, One was Audrey Dugee, who co-produced The Wonderful Adventures of Mary Seacole in the 1980s, which brought Mary Seacole to the forefront. And another was Chris Power, who was a co-writer for Blacks in Britain since 1555. And he lived in Otley and Audrey lived in Knaresborough. So yeah, these people were, and I was like, and they were telling me about black people in Britain. I was going, yeah, okay, yeah, they were probably slaves. I'm not really interested. Thank you. And literally, they wouldn't give up. And they kept on sending me information. And I'd just go, oh, okay, push it to one side. It took about 10 years for the penny to drop. And I was going, oh, I see, okay. So literally, in telling the story of Africans in Britain, you get the wider perspective, of course, because Britain was such a major player. But then further research took me even further back. And so I am very, and then I went to university to look at culture and representation. Okay, so in terms of representation, this is a frieze on Park Row. Has anybody seen this frieze? Yeah, it's number 18 Park Row. You can pass it by or you can glimpse it, but it sends a message. This is about Leeds trading in the 19th century. Effectively, Leeds transforming from a town to a city. And you will notice that it's representative of different nations of the world, most of whom are standing, but noticeably, there is an African, a Negro, who is stooped over bales of cotton, wearing a loincloth. Now we have to bear in mind that this, am I speaking loud enough? You can hear me? Thank you. We have to bear in mind that this frieze was commissioned in the late 1800s and was actually erected in 1905 above what was then called Martin's Bank. Excuse me. And so in 1905, slavery in America had already been abolished 50 years. So why the need to present an African in a loincloth, which is kind of contradictory, stooped over bales of cotton, because that suggests America. But then we have to bear in mind that in 1886, I think it was, or 84, that the Berlin Conference, where they carved up Africa, European nations carved up Africa, so Africa was colonized at this moment, and it wasn't the done thing to promote Africans as abled human beings capable of looking after their own affairs. It was important to represent them as helpless, childlike, savage beings. And that's something that followed us right throughout the 20th century until later on. There is another representation of an African in Leeds City Centre, and that's of a commemoration of the visit of Nelson Mandela to Leeds in the early 2000s. And I love the interpretation of, when you see Nelson Mandela, you see these hands kind of like reaching out to you, and he loved to hug people, so I think that's lovely. But in terms of physical representation and full-bodied representation, there's a disturbing angle in terms of, how many people here have seen a full statue of someone of African origin standing up? It's very rare. The stooping image is 1 degree above the kneeling, appealing image on his knees. So that's actually a degree up to be stooped. But we recently got a statue for Mary Seacole in London, which is really good. So, she's standing large outside, is it St. Thomas's Hospital, I think? And so that's wonderful. But in a city that I was born and grew up in, that stooping image is the only full-bodied representation. If it wasn't there, no worries. I mean, because let's face it, the representation of women in the city centre is also, wanting compared to the number of men. Women are represented as mythological figures, effectively. And so throughout my career over the past 30 years, I work with different organizations trying to promote African voices, Africans who stood up for themselves and were quite articulate. We commemorated the 150th anniversary of Frederick Douglass, the African-American abolitionist, who's pictured on the bottom left there. And he spoke at what was then the Mechanics Institute, which then was later became the Civic Theatre, where I received a lot of my amateur theatre experience. And then it is now the Leeds Museum in Millennium Square. And he also visited Leeds in 1846, and he taught himself to read and write on the plantation in Maryland, where he was from, even though it was illegal, and the punishment could be very severe, including death. He taught himself to read and write, and precisely why slave owners didn't want the enslaved to learn to read and write was the exact reason was what happened to him. It gave him impetus to want his freedom. And so therefore that's why people weren't encouraged. And the first time he ran away, he was captured and punished severely. And he was not deterred, and by the age of around 21, he achieved his freedom. And so this was put into a theatre production at the West Yorkshire Playhouse, and that's David Hamilton there playing Frederick Douglass. David Hamilton is the founding member who conceived Phoenix Dance Company, which has gone on to incredible success with a global reputation. And the guy in the funny red jacket there is me playing another African descendant who became an abolitionist, Olaudah Equiano, and we might be hearing from him a bit later. But in 2007, it gave us a chance to tell stories that we kind of vaguely knew about, but wanted to explore the narrative of Africans in Britain. So we commemorated the bicentenary of the 1807 parliamentary bill that stopped Africans being transported from Africa. And we had a 4-year project funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And this 4-year project looked at different aspects of narrative throughout the African diaspora. Okay, so let's look at the oldest human being, the oldest human relative, who was named Lucy by the pathologists who were examining her. She's 3.2 million years old, but the Ethiopians called her Dinknesh. Now, in terms of appropriation, obviously, you wouldn't have a 3.2 million year old Ethiopian called Lucy. I don't think so. I might be wrong. But in terms of appropriation now, Hollywood takes it a step further. And we introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Lucy, who has blonde hair and bluish, hazelish eyes. And she has superpowers. But we know that when Hollywood makes films, anything to do with Africans largely, we've seen films on Egypt where the Africans are just slaves, and that's a tradition that's been with Hollywood right from the very beginning. And well and truly, Africans have to take more control of the narratives in terms of self-representation. So that's appropriation. Now let's look at the oldest Africans in Yorkshire. You actually have authentic mummified Egyptians buried here in Yorkshire from 2,000 years ago. And by gum, it's a bit of a shock to most people. I on my Leeds Black History Walk, which I run from April to October, the kind of more warmer months, I say over 50 mummified Egyptians have been discovered in York. And people go, oh, and 2 in Barnsley. No. I don't know why that is. For some reason it's acceptable in York, but not Barnsley. And so this comes as a shock. Obviously this has to do with the Romans. They came with the Romans, and what people should know is that Africans were part of the very early Roman Empire before they came to Yorkshire. So naturally Africans were just with them, and they revered what's called Egyptian mysticism, but I call Kemetic wisdom, because Egypt was called Kemet before the Greeks arrived, and the Greeks were only in Egypt for 300 years. And so for thousands of years, it was known as Kemet. And so this Kemetic wisdom was practiced here in Yorkshire 2,000 years ago. So you might say African spirituality was here in Yorkshire 2,000 years ago. And it's not so different from a lot of the spiritual pursuit, you might say, of West Indians, from what I've observed, is that the principles are very, very similar, because as West Indians, we're yearning for where we came from and what that narrative is, and what did we lose, what have we lost. And in York you had priests, obviously, because only consecrated priests could conduct mummification, and it took decades to learn how to mummify. And you had the Bangled Lady of York, who is, they studied her DNA, and she is sub-Saharan African. Her tomb was very rich, laden with lots of wealthy items, but it's worth pointing out that she was buried with lots of bangles, and 2 significantly, of which one was made of ivory from Africa, obviously, and the other was made of ebony, jet from Whitby. So there's a nice kind of like multicultural symbolism going on there 2,000 years ago. There were soldiers, of course, but there were also emperors. There were 4 emperors of African descent that we know of, and one of them definitely was based in York, Septimus Severus. He was from Libya, and he ordered in North Africa, and he ordered his food from Libya. Takeaway, delivery. But as far as we know, the oldest African in Yorkshire goes back more than 2,000, is older than 2,000 years, and his name is Nessi Amun, otherwise known as the Leeds Mummy. He is 3,000 years old, and it is said that his tomb was discovered near the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. And here's Queen Hatshepsut, and she's a bit older. Queen Hatshepsut is from the 18th dynasty, which is the same dynasty as Tutankhamun. And notice the difference, Tutankhamun and Nessi Amun. Amun being the supreme being. People say that Africans are polytheistic, that they worship animals, but it's, in one sense, more complicated than that, but in another way, a lot simpler than that as well. And so the Leeds mummy, Nessi Amun, was a priest in one of the many temples, probably Luxor and Karnak. And in Hales, Luxor has the largest temple complex in the world where you could fill several cathedrals in that one temple, And in Hare Hills, where I grew up, you have, just above Hare Hills Road, you have Carnac Streets and Luxor Streets, and that's because the Victorians liked to travel, and that was some of the favourite places, their favourite destinations. But very quickly as well, I just discovered recently that opposite where I grew up on Roundhay Road, you had Lascelles Streets, Zetland Streets, Lowther Streets, and another one, the name escapes me. And the four of them were all plantation owners, and they've all got rows of streets together. They were sitting members of parliament, and they also had horses that ran in the same races. So they had a good social life. But I was doing a tour of St. George's Hall in Bradford, a Black History tour, because many African-American abolitionists and entertainers visited St. George's Hall, and looking at the documentation discovered that the Earl of Zetland laid the foundation stone, and the Earl of Harewood was the president of the opening ceremony. So they also engaged in cultural activities and invested in cultural activities. But the foundation stone of Leeds Infirmary also has the name Lascelles. The first two chancellors of the University of Leeds have the name Lascelles. The first president of the Yorkshire Penny Bank has the name Lascelles. And as many of you will know, Harewood House was built on the fortunes of sugar from plantations in Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica. And all that effort went toward building basically the infrastructure in Yorkshire for a growing, shall we say, civilization, expanding the British Empire. And one of the great models of such aspirations is actually Queen Hatshepsut, who I would say is probably one of the most powerful rulers the world has known, just in terms of how she expanded the Kemetic Empire, and improved trade. But with references to today as well, there was realization then too, that life isn't just about making money, that life is also about, there is a spiritual aspect, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to each other, to nature, and to the universe, the environment, effectively. And so the Cometians built temples, as did the Nubians. And here are some examples of Nubian temples, and these are more than 3,000 years old, perhaps more than 5. I'm not an authority on it, but you see the big pillars there. And whenever I ask people on my walk about what are the cultural, architectural influences behind such grand pillars, inevitably you get classical Greco-Roman influences. But as I say, when these pillars were built, Greece wasn't a big deal, shall we say, at the time. And so therefore there's a lot of hidden narratives, obviously. And the temple at the bottom that you can see, that's the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, and it's carved out of the rock. It's quite interesting that Nesyamun was known to be an incense burner in temples, and Queen Hatshepsut loved her incense. And of course, as you know, that incense is used in both in the Christian church, in the various denominations. And that began, and she would go to Punt, which we think is now the Yemen, to collect the ingredients to make the best incense. But Queen Hatshepsut is also the first documented ruler that we know of that conducted in what we call economic botany, effectively taking plants from one part of the empire, manufacturing it, or transporting it to another part of the empire for profit. And that's actually the basis of transatlantic trade, if you think about it. With slavery, it was cotton, sugar, tobacco, rice, plant-based economy. And that was the beginnings of Kew Gardens as well. And so the Cometians had a philosophy called Ma'at, M-A'-A-T, and which is about balance, really. And they had three main deities. So you had the supreme being, Amun, or Amen. I don't need to say any more about that, do I? And you have three main deities, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, their Kemetic names being Osar, Oset, and Heru. And it is reputed that from Heru, we get the Greek word hero. Heru came from a planet that was destroyed. He could fly at high speed, and he fought for truth, justice, and righteousness. Apart from me, who does that sound like? Superman. So, yeah, comic book writers can get inspiration from ancient mythology, as we all can. So, the Isis and Heru narrative is very similar in terms of the virgin birth, etc., etc. And so, very earlier on, there was this narrative of the Virgin Mother and Child, and even in many parts of Eastern Europe, Mary and Jesus were portrayed with dark skin, in Poland and many other places. And then after the Renaissance, you get what we're more familiar with today, but it's just interesting how the last image has pushed back the other two narratives. So Ma'at is about various principles. They also have 42 laws. I have not sinned, I have not stolen, I have not been gluttonous, I have not committed adultery, I have not, the emphasis being on I have not. And bear in mind that Moses grew up in Egypt as a prince, so he grew up with Ma'at. And it's interesting how I have not then became thou shalt not, which produces an external voice. In ancient Kemet, everyone was responsible for their own morality, their own ethics. And then, as it goes, at the end of your life, your heart is weighed against a feather. If you've lived a good life, the feather will be heavier than your heart. And so, if we focus on balance, outside the Nubian temples as well, you'd find obelisks, which represents eternity, the afterlife. And outside a temple with two obelisks, so for example, there's an obelisk on the Thames in London called Cleopatra's Needle, yeah. But it also has a sister obelisk, which is in, anybody? No, it's New York, Central Park. So very, very far apart, but they were from the same temple. And they probably had nothing to do with Cleopatra whatsoever, because they reckon the age is around the time of probably Queen Hatshepsut. But there's something interesting I'd like to read. Europeans went to great lengths to transport authentic Nubian obelisks all over the world, including going to the expensive length of building specific ships that could take these massive monuments, taller than this room, obviously. But this is a great explanation why. This is about the Cleopatra's Needle in London arriving, and someone's giving a talk. He referred to the history of the monument and to its being composed of granite from the ridge some 700 miles up the Nile, Nubia. He admired the ingenuity of the ancients who could set up and pull down such immense blocks, and he had often thought that such an example of the engineering skill of the people of some 3,300 years ago should be, for more reasons than one, transferred to the center of the engineering skill of the present day. And this was written in, I hope nobody's collapsed at my boring talk. No, it's okay. This was written in the 1870s when Cleopatra's Needle arrived. So it's that thing of revering ancient civilizations, and this is what the Romans and Greeks did, by literally attaching yourself to that heritage and claiming it as yours. It then enriches your new growing civilization, as it were. And so the two obelisks outside the temples, interestingly, in terms of balance, represent what the Ethiopians and Egyptians believed at that time, that the human condition is kind of riddled with extreme opposites, and we're always struggling between one or the other. So it could be hot, cold, good, evil, male, female, or in terms of the temple, yesterday and tomorrow. So, you get rid of all your anxieties about, or anger about what happened yesterday, or your anxieties about tomorrow. When you enter into the entrance of the temple, you're in the moment. Today, be at peace. But when your culture is appropriated, it distances you from your heritage, no matter how ancient. And we can, easily look to the North American, Native Americans and Native Australians to see when you unplug people from the universe of their heritage, they lose their way and turn to alcohol and whatever. And this is from the Leeds Mercury of 1833. Dr. Russell says of the modern Nubians, whose ancestors erected such splendid temples and palaces, in surveying the wonders which crowd the banks of the Nile, we are struck with the reflection that the wealth, power, and genius, whence they derived their origin, have entirely passed away. Throughout the whole world, in short, there is no greater contrast to be witnessed than between what now is and what must once have been in Ethiopia and Egypt. And that's from the Leeds Mercury in 1833, recognizing that Nubians were walking with their head down when they were surrounded by these incredible things that their ancestors had created. But when you are divorced from the meaning behind those things, so the Greeks came along and called this statue a sphinx. Now in Greek mythology, it looks like a sphinx without the wings, but in Greek mythology, a sphinx asks you a riddle. If you don't get it, you die. That has nothing to do with this monument. This monument is called Heru Em Arket, Heru on the horizon, and is looking, at the time we presume, toward the constellation of Leo. And the whole thing about having a human head and a lion's body isn't animism, it's just recognizing that we have a spiritual connection with the stars, with animals, with plants, with our environment, and therefore it's all part of the same narrative. So they combine that with, you'll see birds' heads and a human body, or, representing different deities. That means that deity has the spirit of a lion. Or Heru is often represented as a hawk, because they say he has a keen eye, he's got great vision, and he can fly really fast. So, you're not leaving nature out of your narrative in terms of your place on this planet. So, when you call it something else, and generations of people then kind of lose the original meaning, they lose their way. And that's what's been happening to Africans over the past 2,000 years. On top of that, when the Europeans arrived after colonialism, if they saw any evidence of African intelligence, African rulership, they would erase it. So Napoleon came across these statues of the 25th dynasty. They were duly smashed to bits and placed in a pit altogether, which was only discovered a couple of decades ago. And part of the problem with Black history is that even though it was discovered a couple of decades ago, and a lot of people of African heritage go, look, we've got a heritage. We were in Egypt, we ruled Egypt. Nobody's listening because everybody's already full of what they've already been presented of, and it doesn't compute. What do you mean Africans ruled Egypt? No, they didn't. You get all kind of obfuscations, but this is the 25th dynasty, and they were all Nubian rulers, and there were Nubian rulers before, but I don't go into that because we've got evidence of the 25th dynasty, which can't be argued against now, and hopefully we'll build and show more, the more that there is investment in that area, and we can provide the evidence. But there is no doubt there were many, many Nubian rulers in Egypt. In fact, we believe that the pharaonic dynasties were of Nubian origin. And the philosophy definitely can be traced back to Nubia. If we go up the Nile or down the Nile? I get confused. But basically you've got Kemet, Nubia, Ethiopia, Uganda. Some of the original philosophy of Ma'at and some of the narratives of the deities, which all came from studying the stars and combining it with human and nature narratives. Some of the origins can be found to a mountain in Uganda, and some of the symbolism as well. And moving swiftly on, coming to West Africa just before the transatlantic trade, from the 9th century to the 16th century, to the year 1591 to be precise, West Africa had an incredibly rich and active trade route. And there were 3 great Islamic empires, which we don't hear about: the Ghanaian Empire, the Malian Empire, and the Songhai Empire. And it's in the Malian Empire that you get the richest man in the world in history and of all time. Whether, I think Mark Zuckerberg's probably aiming to claim that mantle, but Mansa Musa had gold mines, and they traded, as you can see, all kinds of things. This is not a savage, backward civilization that were on their knees, and as Joseph Conrad said in the late 1800s, these people have never risen above the Stone Age. That's far from the case. If you look at all the things that they manufactured and traded, and even beads. If a village had no resources and could only make beads, yeah, we'll take your beads. Here's some sandals. Here's some foods. Nobody was left out. Yes. So, in the 14th century, an image of Mansa Musa appeared on European maps, wearing a golden crown with a golden gown, a golden staff, sitting on a golden throne and holding a big piece of golden bling. That Europeans would have seen nothing like it. And notice architecture as well on the map. Architecture isn't something we associate with Africa. And apart from just admiring his wealth, he was also a patron of the University of Timbuktu, just up there. And Timbuktu was a university town with, believe it or not, up to 25,000 students. And although they had gold and salt, which they traded, their number one source of income was books. They transcribed from a lot of the ancient Greeks and Romans that were in that part of the world, And in fact, it was when the Moors brought those Arabic texts back to Europe that then Europe was reconnected with Roman and Greek wisdom, and you get the Enlightenment, and we come out of the Dark Ages, as it were. Timbuktu University influenced the building of Toledo University in Spain, and Oxford and Cambridge came after that. I know it seems incredibly hard to believe, but you have to ask, why did Alexander build his library in Egypt? Is it because he was bringing wisdom, or was the wisdom already there? We have to ask ourselves that. So in 1591, the Songhai Empire came to an end when Morocco invaded, and Morocco in North Africa invaded the Songhai Empire with the help of Queen Elizabeth I, who provided guns, gunpowder, cannons, and mercenaries, and as a reward gained access to West Africa's Gold Coast. So for me, it's called the Battle of Tondibi. And in my eyes, that's one of the most important battles in British history, because Britain hasn't looked back in terms of building wealth. Whereas, and you can, well, it's there in the culture, in terms of literature and the arts, everything, and trade, and the navy, everything blossomed after that, because once you got gold, and then the slaves came after. It was the gold. The Royal Africa Company dealt with gold, and then they started to deal with slaves, but only the elite members of British society could trade. And Daniel Defoe was hired as like a spin doctor to sell the idea of slavery to the elite British public. And then it was after that he wrote Robinson Crusoe, which was to appeal to the middle classes. Hey, you can get involved as well. Just big up yourself. You can do this. And then you might say there was a reversal of fortune, because Africa is still immensely rich, but lost control of its resources, lost control of its trading its resources. It's important to talk about resistance. The Portuguese were the first to arrive because the Catholic Church decreed that only Spain and Portugal could convert heathens or kill them, and either way take their resources. Queen Nzinga of the Congo, she fought from the front in battles against the Portuguese after negotiating treaties. When they broke the treaties, she went to war, and she warred against the Portuguese for 20 years. But and then resistance went right throughout African history. But as I said, I can talk for England, so I'm just going to share with you now the narrative of a Nigerian abolitionist. Warmest greetings, worthy friends. It is indeed a great honor to be invited here to share with you the narrative of my life. My name is Olaudah Equiano. I was born in 1745 in the village of Isaka, which is in the ancient land of Benin, West Africa. I lived there with my mother, my father, my 5 brothers, and my little sister. My father was a very important man in our village, and I knew that when I grew up that I would be important too. In the tradition of our ancestors, I would be what you might call a judge. My mother went to great pains to educate my mind, particularly in the arts of agriculture and war. Yes, our women are also warriors who bravely march alongside the men and fight. One day, when all the adults had gone to the field to tillage, my sister and I were playing a game outside our house when 2 men and a woman climbed over our compound wall, and before we could make any noise, they put their hands over our mouths, tied our hands behind our backs, and took us away from our home. Although they spoke the same language as us, we would not eat with them. The only comfort we had was to bathe in each other's tears. The following day would bring even greater sorrow when my sister and I were separated. It did not matter how we pleaded with them not to part us. She was torn from my arms, and I would never see my sister again. After several months of being sold and resold, we arrived at the sea, and I was sold into the belly of our ship. Men, women, and children were screaming and wailing. I myself was very sick. The constant movement of the ship made my head spin, and the stench of the sick and the dying and the dead. When we arrived in the West Indies, I was sold to a sea captain who fought throughout the 7-year war. It was my job on his ship to make sure that the gunpowder during the battle was where it was needed. This was very dangerous work. It would only take a spark to ignite the gunpowder and it would explode. And I saw this happen to many young boys my own age. When we were not fighting a war, I learned from others on the ship how to read and write in English. This transformed my mind and filled my imagination, and I was led to believe that I would be freed for my bravery in the 7-year war against France. But this was a lie. Instead, I was sold to another sea captain who also promised me my freedom if I paid him what I had cost. As he delivered goods from island to island, and although it is illegal for an enslaved person to earn a living for themselves, I traded goods too, secretly. And after 3 years, I managed to save what I had cost. Was he going to cheat me too, like my last master? He took the money and set me free. At the age of 21, I was as free and as good as any other man. Now, to cut a long story short, I earned my living at sea, and then I decided to get rid of this evil of slavery for good. And I moved to London, and I worked with other Africans. We became known as the Sons of Africa, and we made our presence felt in London society. And I wrote a book. Yes, I wrote a book, and I called it The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African. Gustavus Vasa was my slave name, some Swedish king, but I never forgot my real name. Now I go around to England and Ireland, Scotland and Wales, selling many thousands of copies of my book. And when I am here in the north, I have a special message to the manufacturers. Now surely, if you exchanged your manufactured goods for our many manufactured goods, we are very good with the smelting of the iron. We make the implements for the tillaging of the field. You must have heard of our very famous Benin bronzes. We work with bronze exquisitely well, as we do with silver, with the leather, and many other items. But if you exchange your manufactured goods for human beings, we will never learn about each other. You have listened very well to my story and to my thoughts, and I thank you. If we work together, we can get rid of this evil of slavery for good. I hope you agree with me. I remain your most humble servant, Olaudah Equiano. Thank you. Equiano visited Yorkshire in 1791 and worked alongside the likes of William Wilberforce, of course, and Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson. So on the Leeds Black History Walk now, I shared this history as I've shared with you today on the Leeds Black History Walk, and plus many other narratives as well. And that's open to community groups, members of the public, schools, universities, and corporate organizations and public organizations as well. We start on the Parkinson Steps, and you remember I mentioned columns, and I ask what are the cultural influences. Notice the Parkinson Tower as an obelisk with a pyramid on top, what I would call Kemetic esoteric symbols. And then you come across narratives, you know, like from all over the place, to do with the British Empire. Prince Alamayu arrived in Leeds in September 1879 to see his favorite tutor, Professor Cyril Ransom, who is the father of Arthur Ransom, Swallows and Amazons, author. But Professor Cyril Ransom hosted Prince Alamayu, who was effectively an orphan adopted by Queen Victoria. But the British had invaded Abyssinia and raided the palace where Prince Alamayu grew with lions on top of a mountain with, you know, that incredible fresh mountain air. So the Leeds climate wasn't suited to his our constituency, and he contracted pleurisy on the chest and died in November 14th, 1879. Queen Victoria sent the best physicians to his bedside, and a train took him from Leeds, took his corpse from Leeds to Windsor Castle, where he remains the only non-European royal to be buried in the Windsor Royal Catacombs. But his father, Emperor Tewodros, had noted that Europeans were arming, you know, after this was before the carving up of Africa. This was in preparation for it, you might say. Noticed that Europeans were arming his enemies, and he didn't have any guns. But he had nonetheless united Ethiopia in response. And when the English invaded Abyssinia, they stole over 100 significant cultural, religious heritage items from the palace. And they knew what they were looking for because Alamayu Emperor Tewodros had always been friendly with the British, and had one particular British soldier live in the palace for 4 years. And he had learned the language and the culture. You're not going to believe his name, but it's true. His name was Captain Speedy. So the British knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. And you might say, well, what kind of significant cultural heritage, spiritual items does Ethiopia have? When you consider the royal line goes back 3,000 years to the Queen of Sheba, who's mentioned in the Bible. Her relationship with King Solomon reputedly produced a child, Menelik I, and Queen of Sheba converted Ethiopia to a Jewish state, which lasted for 1,000 years. And then Ethiopia became the first nation to convert to Christianity before the Holy Roman Empire had really kicked in. And so you're talking about some of the most authentic Christian heritage items and Judaic items as well. Another narrative is Liddon Hall, which is now a student hall of residence on the central campus of the University of Leeds, that was built by tobacco from a slave plantation in Virginia, and then miraculously, the house was then purchased by an abolitionist. So you've got this rich heritage, and you'll notice that there's a blue plaque on the wall there. That doesn't mention anything that I'm about to share with you. It's about somebody who invented a thermometer. Ironically, it's the same doctor that was at the bedside of Prince Alamayu as well, but that's just a loose connection. But the tobacco that the manufacturer brought to Leeds was manufactured just behind the Corn Exchange in what was also called Waterloo House. And you can see it's very close to Leeds Parish Church there. But in the 1920s, they produced, another company in the same building produced tobacco called Old Sambo, but that was in the 1920s. But in the 19th century, imagine all those jobs that have been created by transatlantic trade and slavery, but there's no memorial, there's nothing to mark that history, and we do everything to avoid it. And by not acknowledging it, it's almost like perpetuating the degradation in a way, the degradation narrative. And so, for example, you've got monuments in London to animals who served in World Wars I and II, but there is no monument to West Indians who for 400 to 500 years laboured for free, generation after generation, for the British economy, not for their own economy. None of that money went to the West Indies. The money came to Britain and invested in the Industrial Revolution, engineering development, etc., etc., etc. But there's no recognition. Again, that's a continuation of the degradation. I regard exclusion as misrepresentation. But not everybody felt the same way in terms of degrading Negroes. In 1848, the same Quaker who purchased Leadenhall wrote a book called In Tribute to the Negro in 1848, in which he writes, with regard to the intellectual capabilities of the African race, it may be observed that Africa was once the nursery of science and literature, and it was from thence that they were disseminated among the Greeks and Romans. Solon, Plato, Pythagoras, and others of the master spirits of ancient Greece performed pilgrimages into Africa in search of knowledge. There they sat at the feet of Ebon, black philosophers, to drink in wisdom. Say not then that Africa is without her heraldry of science and of fame. Of course, in 2006, the then Lord Mayor of Leeds, our current Prime Minister, wrote, I think it was in The Spectator, that Africans are not as intelligent as Europeans. In the same year, a professor from the University of Leeds said the same thing. When it's reported in the media worldwide, it's never challenged. The assumption is, well, it's true, but you're not allowed to say it. It's not politically correct. Nobody contradicts it and says, no, that's rubbish because, and even this year in January 2019, Professor Dr. Watson of Watson and Crick fame, the guys who discovered the DNA strands, even he, came out and said, Africans are not as intelligent as Europeans. And of course, it gets reported worldwide. So a Nobel-winning scientist, there must be some truth in it. But it's time to bury that argument and put it to bed, because it's very damaging. I've been hearing that as a child, and to be perfectly honest, I grew up believing that right up into my 40s, because I looked around me and I saw all that Europeans had left for their descendants, and I thought, I don't have that kind of heritage. I can't point to anything that my ancestors have done for me, so there must be some truth in it. And it's a complete fallacy. And if we go back to the 18th century, before Wilson Armistead, there was a Count Volney who wrote Ruins of Empire, in which he wrote, and you won't find this in the American edition, there in Egypt, a race of men, now rejected for their black skin and woolly hair, are the very ones to which we owe our arts and our sciences, founded on the study of the laws of nature. And that's a more explicit description in terms of founded on the study of the laws of nature. Civilizations, from the Nile Valley civilizations, contributed a unique thing to the world in that they observed the stars and created narratives related to the stars, from which we get the names of the constellations and some of the stories relating to the constellations. And the three main constellations, as I mentioned, relate to Isis, Osiris, and Horus. But there are obviously many others. And the deities, if you learned about the deities, you were in fact learning about science. There's the goddess Nut, some of you, or the deity Nut, some of you have noticed she's arched over usually and has stars on her side. Effectively, if you look into it, she represents the ozone layer. They had deities for all the elements and gases and various aspects of nature and human relationships. And so the Greeks learned from that, and I don't think that should be such a big deal. But obviously, if you want to justify slavery... Okay, it was nice talking to you, thank you. I've got a few more minutes. If you want to justify slavery, then you cannot possibly acknowledge any kind of human qualities associated to those that you want to exploit. And Africa being one of the richest continents, that's the main reason why the narrative of Africa has been so downgraded and Africans themselves once removed from the great heritage. But if you want to know what the connection might be between ancient Egypt and West Africa, why is somebody from Jamaica talking about ancient Egypt? If you Google one thing today, Google the Dogon and Sirius. French anthropologists in the 19th century thought that they were mad when they said that there's a planet which they call the dog star because it warns them when to plant their when to plant in the fields, or when to reap the harvest before it goes bad or something. That star appears and gives them a warning, so they call it the dog star because that's what dogs give you a warning. But that dog star is Sirius, and the Dogon said it's one of the densest planets in our universe, and only recent telescopes and scientific measurements have actually proved that that's the case. The Dogon knew for generations that Mercury has rings around it, but it's not just Sirius. They knew about a satellite star that goes around Sirius, which is called Sirius A, but they also knew about Sirius B. I think it's Sirius B that's the dense planet, but you can't see it with the naked eye. And a lot of their words have connections with ancient Egypt as well, and the culture. Something important I forgot to mention about Kemet was that it was matriarchal. So that's another reason to forget about it. Pretend. The three Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they all have some kind of connection to Ma'at. I already mentioned Moses. In Kemet, they prayed 5 times a day according to the movement of the sun. There's all kind of these different connections with the three Abrahamic faiths, but none of them acknowledge any credit whatsoever. Wilson Armistead, the name of Frederick Douglass's newspaper was called the North Star as well, which connects to Egypt. So Frederick Douglass was invited to Leeds by Wilson Armistead, as was many other African-American abolitionists, and very quickly the most celebrated being Ellen and William Craft, who escaped from their plantation because Ellen was very light-skinned due to licentiousness on southern plantations, shall we say, to put it politely, by slave owners. And so she was very light-skinned, and her husband was very dark-skinned. So she pretended to be a man, as you can see on the bottom left, and in that disguise pretended that her husband was his slave, and they traveled 1,000 miles to freedom, which became the title of their book, which they published in England in 1861. But my favorite is Sarah Parker Remond, because we live in a society where there are still subjects that are difficult to talk about. She addressed large groups of men, and her chosen topic was licentiousness on southern plantations. Effectively, the enslaved had no recourse to justice in America or the West Indies. So all kinds of atrocities were committed on Africans on plantations, and they could not complain. So she was not born into slavery. She was born in New York, and she spoke on their behalf. And she spoke of the hundreds of thousands of children that were born out of these forced sexual encounters. But if you can imagine being a black woman talking to groups of white Victorian men about sex, if she can do it, then anything is possible. We can talk about anything. So I definitely think, I use her as an example to young people, that we all have difficult things personally to talk about sometimes. But it's about trying to find the right words and then practicing and becoming more confident in speaking. Another woman who spoke out, there have been great African women throughout Africa's history, and the idea of Africa being a misogynistic, I think that came about with Western intervention, where, when people have got guns and you're forced to comply. In colonial times, there was one female queen called, does anybody have a name? From Ghana, Queen Yaa Asantewaa. Yaa Asantewaa, she's worth looking up. She said, if you men will not fight against the British, we women will. And so she did. But I.D.B. Wells came to Britain, came to Yorkshire to speak against lynchings, which after slavery was abolished, lynchings became a commonplace thing to try and keep black people in their place. And there was also the Wall Street attack of the 1920s, when black Americans built this town in Tulsa that was very successful. They had their own banks, their own cinema, their own schools. Things were going very well for them. But then America engaged in its first case of aerial bombing upon their own people in America, and the town was destroyed, burnt to the ground, because people were jealous of its success. They didn't like the idea of black success. One African American who after slavery, became a member of a singing group, but was born on a plantation during slave times. He refused to return back to America, became a teacher in Harrogate, and died in 1915, Thomas Rutling. Britain's first black circus owner, Pablo Fanck, is buried in Leeds. He was born in Norwich in 1810, and I try to bring these stories alive. And because, as you notice with the Equiano, you can talk about slavery, but when you hear the first narrative, you get the human quality. It becomes more humane and not just a subject. And so I've done the stories of the Crafts, the Fanks, and Thomas Rutling, and many others, Frederick Douglass as well. And hanging out with celebrities is, it's just one of the terrible things you have to do, as part of the job. And that's me doing Pablo Fanck in Norwich for Anglia TV, because they had a student halls of residence called the Pablo Fanck Building. And just very recently in Newcastle, they've opened up a Frederick Douglass building on their campus. And I'm due to go up there on the 15th of November to share with people the narrative of Frederick Douglass by personifying his. And there's more information about Pablo Fanck. He gained more publicity, more celebrity in the 1960s when John Lennon discovered one of his posters and based a song on the Sgt. Pepper album on the lyrics of that poster, and that song is For the Benefit of Mr. Kite, late of Pablo Fanck's Fair. And this is St. George's Field, where Pablo Fanck is buried in, which uncannily has Kemetic esoteric symbolism, including the original entrance for the Leeds Cemetery, which opened in the 1830s, before it became a field. That entrance is as close to a Kemetic temple entrance as you'll ever get. And then this is a stone of a woman who was born into slavery in Antigua and is buried in Yeadon. And she made such an impression on her parishioners that they did this wonderful stone in her memory. And because of that, we know a little bit more about her story. But literally, there are thousands of Africans buried over the centuries in Britain, and hundreds probably, if not more, here in Yorkshire, who we don't know about. So, to finish, we started off with that stooping image, but there are things that we can do with creativity. We can make him gold. That's effectively what he represents. Instead of the pitiful image of intention, we can turn it around. And gold has influenced Britain's development from the 16th century, definitely. And Africans are still bringing gold to Britain today. So we need to adapt how we look at our multicultural society today in terms of representation. And I'm very pleased with a lot of the positive responses that I've been receiving. I could go on. As I said, I can talk for England. But thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'd be more than willing to answer. Thank you. It's still a developing field, and that's what's exciting about it. It's what I would refer to as a shared heritage. And a lot of people, especially in a Brexit environment, may not want to hear that. But you can't look at the contributions over thousands of years, because even you look at Freemasonry, which can be found in every nook and cranny of the country, every corner, every town and village and city, has connections to Kemetic wisdom. They use a lot of Kemetic symbolism as well. And yeah, if you look at temple works in Holbeck, and it's modeled on the frontage of an Egyptian temple, but it's got the winged disc of Horus, which is, so it's like, we have a shared humanity and a shared heritage. And I think if we use that, we can better combat the environment, because that's the main battle. If we fight each other, then we're going to let the environment decline. And in this moment, we need to be fighting together for the environment, for everybody's sake. Yes?
Joe, thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and wisdom on this. You've been doing it for, 2007 comes to mind, I know you've been doing it for longer.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, is there, from doing it over the past few decades, is there an audience is more accepted, or is there more of a kickback? Does it ebb and flow? Does it change? Yeah. Or what? What's your perspective?
Well, I'd say recently, very recently, I think probably since the election of a recent president, I think people have been going, I thought racism was over, but it's obviously not. What's going on? And so I think people want to know more, to make a more balanced view. We've all been raised on a very colonial perspective of multiculturalism, I guess. And, there's a kind of like some pyramid of supremacy with the races. That has never really been fully, properly challenged. And because we don't have an argument against it, it's easy as I did growing up. You just accept it and think it must be true. But I think people are realizing, it must be more complicated than that. And so I think people want to know more information. And I suppose in my gut, I accepted it in my mind, but my gut wouldn't relax with it, wouldn't settle with it. And so therefore I had to go out and try and find more information. And then the more information I found, and speaking to artists like David Hamilton and other colleagues like Khadija Ibrahim and others, and you just talk to people and you go, this doesn't add up. And then suddenly you discover Ma'at. And I'm influenced by a professor in America called Dr. Anthony Browder, who wrote a book on how Washington was designed like Egypt, with key buildings like the pyramids in alignment with the constellations. So Washington, D.C. is actually mapped based on the constellations of Isis and Osiris, male and female energy forces. So the White House, Lincoln's Memorial, everything is placed in alignment with certain aspects of the constellation. Um, but in saying that, you'll find pyramids and stone monuments all over the world that link with the constellations. There is a pyramid on every continent, I believe, including Australia, I know. And the standing stone circles in Scotland, Stonehenge. The three pyramids in Giza, aligned to Orion, Orion's belt, connect with pyramids in China and also the standing statues on Easter Island. So I think there's more that connects us than actually divides us. But there's less money to be made from division, from unity. Yeah, and there's more money to be made from division. Yeah. But so the more I learn, I'm just like, wow, this is amazing. And it's fantastic that we do have this shared heritage, but it's how well we can get that across.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask, I feel like in the education system, we're sort of taught everything from a very European lens. So I remember learning a bit about Egypt, but never the rest of Africa, and the media sort of, in my eyes, kind of presents Africa as being, there's Egypt, and this is where the poor people live, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, do you think it's ignorance, or do you think that it's almost an unconscious bias that we're not taught about differences? Because I could tell you like 100 differences between England and France.
Yeah.
If someone asked me what's the difference between Rwanda and Burundi, then I wouldn't really be able to.
Yeah, they're all the same, aren't they? They're savages. They haven't evolved. Well, I mean, ancient Kemet was very, very diverse. So you had Persians, the Mesopotamians. You had Hittites from Turkey, as well as Africans, Ethiopians, Nubians, and in the Bible you'll find many peoples who are of African origin as well. So back in the day, there were differences. It wasn't about skin color. It was about what your narrative was. And in Nigeria, where they speak over 400 different languages and come from different cultures effectively, the analogy I use is that if you're in a country or a nation with 400 languages, that's a very tolerant nation. It means people are prepared to listen to each other's stories without feeling threatened about their own narrative. And so I think that was the atmosphere. But then the more, like, say, you get, right, everybody must speak Greek, then I think individuality then is lessened. And also so Egypt is a Greek word. As we know, the Sphinx is a Greek concept. But also the word pyramid is Greek. And in Greek at the time, it meant layers of pancakes. So in other words, you're building your civilization, you want to dismiss other don't worry about that. That's just layers of pancakes. Come on, we can do better. And you want to attach yourself to great civilizations, but you also want to stamp your own identity. So as that goes on, then I think, and because of Africa's resources, I think if Africa didn't have such rich resources, people would just leave Africa alone. And I think the narrative would be told in a much better way now because nobody would have anything to lose. But it's important to mention that the Congo, I mentioned Queen Nzinga, the Congo, they are the only nation, I think, that have never had a break since the Portuguese arrived in the mid-1400s, because it's been consistent. You had the Belgians with King Leopold. That was atrocious. For chocolate and for rubber, Leopold would chop the hands off people's hands if they didn't pick enough, and literally thousands of pairs of hands, thousands of hands were sent to European museums. It was horrendous. The atrocities were just, because he wanted Belgium to catch up with Britain and France, who had been colonizing, and it's the same thing with Germany. They were so eager to catch up that they committed atrocities too. And you see, I think Africa is at the center of World War I. But when you leave Africa and Africans out of history, you get this imperial thing. But for example, why is Africa at the center of World War I? In 1884, when they chopped up Africa, some European nations realized, hang on a minute, our cousins over there, because they were all cousins, weren't they, of Queen Victoria, relate to Queen Victoria. Our cousins got gold, got silver, got this, got that. All we've got is, what is that? Zinc, tin, whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's like, hang on a minute. So they're going to build up their industrial empire. We're going to be left behind. If we attack them now, then we'll... And what was Germany's punishment for being aggressive in its aggression in World War I? They had their African colonies taken away from them, which then led to World War II. So there's a lot of exclusion of Africa and Africans from world history. We know that. We just have to retell it. We just have to keep retelling it in a sensible way rather than in an imperialistic way.
There's a great video on YouTube. It's kind of like, you know, civilization of the area of the continent of Africa divided up over something like 500 years or 1,000 years, or like you can say, see the different the history of colonisation and how it really speeds up. And I kind of forgot that Germany had colonies, you know, and got a lot of
Yeah.
in the area. And 1914 to 1918.
Thanks for coming.
You see how it changes around the world. And it's interesting how when we think of World War I, we don't think of
No.
that area and how that would have been changed and the impact of that the area had on the war and vice versa.
What I say is that if you look at the implements of war from Victorian battles to World War I, it's a vast difference. You're going, how could that be? Then you're thinking, oh, in Africa they came across minerals which they didn't have access to before, so they could create these early tanks and machine guns, and they could do things that they couldn't possibly do before. So therefore, technology moves on at quite a pace. And it's such a stark contrast. You're going, how did that happen? Again, leave Africa out the narrative, then you don't get it. Yeah. Hi.
I'd like to answer this question. I think a lot of people, especially the people in our empowerable education system, they do see it as ignorance is bliss when they don't teach other cultures. Like even when I was growing up, there's nothing about anything but the whites and like, you know, what happened
Yes.
in Europe, America.
Yes.
Like, you know, in all about Africa is just Egypt and like, you know,
Yeah.
what happened there. You don't see things like, you know, that happened in South Africa, in
Yeah.
West Africa, or even other parts of Asia, like where I'm from. Like, you don't learn those things, and I think it is because, and I mean, I don't want any offense to be taken, but people don't like to actually take the time to learn about
Yeah.
things because, you know, oh, it's happened,
Yeah.
or this has already been done and said. So taking the time, I mean, there could have been so many other people that attended this talk, but they haven't.
Yeah.
Because to them it's just, oh, do you know, do you get what?
What am I going to learn? There's nothing to learn. Yeah.
The government really likes to just keep itself because they do think, you know,
Yeah.
without us and without Asians and Africans and all the other people, England and America wouldn't have really existed. We
Yeah.
are the basis, we are the foundation
Yes.
of England being this powerful
As an
having
empire.
money and having
Yes.
all these amazing things, and yet we've left countries
Yes.
in poverty and in war. Like, you know, if you look at
Yes.
Syria, if really
Mhm.
we didn't get help from all these powerful countries,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be in war right now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yes, so imperialism has a lot to answer for in terms of world politics as they are today. I have to kind of humble myself as an actor stroke historian and try and maintain things from my perspective rather than from a political perspective. I do think it's important when talking about the Congo to realize that children aged 6, 8, younger, 9 years old working in mineral mines for the minerals that go into our phones, our satellite systems, batteries, laptops, etc. So our freedom, we think we're quite free, but is it at the expense of others who we choose not to talk about? So one can get very political about that, but at the same time, I can only talk about narrative, and it may surprise you, but it's what civilizations do. Kemet had its imperialist phase, and I think most civilizations have that imperialist phase. And what you do with it, when you become an imperialist, you heighten certain narratives above others. So Kemet did it, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Islam, etc., etc. When you're building an empire, you heighten your own narrative. And when we think about it, Northern Europe only started to be able to write their narrative through pursuits of imperialism. So that writing, believe it or not, is actually still going on. Because every imperialist civilization wants to be recognized as their success is marked on how long they last. So there are people still fighting to continue European imperialism. Through our lifetime, we think imperialism is behind us, but there are people, and America is probably just beginning as well, very intent on keeping themselves at the top of the pyramid at all times, even if that means at the expense of the planet. So it's how we intervene with that narrative. But I'll just say, what you say is correct. Sadly, it's natural, if that makes sense. But it's how we, as smaller nations now, respond to that. Because I don't think we can expect our diverse narratives to be done by the establishment. It just has to be done by us. And I think that's where we're lucky. In a pluralistic society, you have the freedom to put forward your own narrative if you choose to be confident about your own narrative, whereas we know there are many other societies where you can't put across your narrative. You know, your life will be at risk. And that's not going to make you happy, but
Oh no, I already know this. It
Yeah,
makes me
yeah.
very angry.
yeah. But it's
Sad.
yeah, but yes, absolutely. But I think by trying to tell positive narratives, like me trying to make African history golden, hopefully we'll think about Africans not just as natural victims, not just as natural starving objects, but as people, you know, who have contributed to civilization and are worthy of being treated as human beings. In many cases, they are not. Hi. Yeah.
Do you not feel though that like regardless of, you know, retelling the history, that we're still essentially on foreign soil? Because even though you say like how West Indians, they were supplying everything for like 300 years, I think you said, we know that obviously Africa is rich in like so many resources that we basically built England and America and all these white countries.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter though that we built it like we still not feel like we're not on the foreign side of this at home.
Well, the thing is, there are Europeans and Americans who are becoming very defensive because they feel that their heritage is at threat. Because the more confidence that people who they think are less than, the more confidence those people get, then it's like, oh, what's happening? Things are changing. So I think it's about how you feel about yourself. And mentioning that Egyptians were here 2,000 years ago, if we look at the Cheddar Man, who's England's oldest skeletal remains, 10,000 years ago, is a person of colour that they've just recently. So, and as I said, there are standing stones on every continent. So I actually think there's a spiritual system that connects us all. So it doesn't matter where in the world we are, we should feel at home because it's the same stars, it's nature. It's just that as human beings, we're different. So I think we should be at home anywhere in the world, and we shouldn't feel like aliens. But in terms of investment in this country, I feel very firmly planted in this country because I know my ancestors have worked hard for it. If I choose not to associate with that and I feel adrift, then I'm not giving credit to my ancestors for the work that they've put into this country and contributed to this country. I don't feel like an alien, but if other people think I'm an alien and I go along with their opinion, that's my fault. You have to have your own narrative of strength. That's not going to be given to you, but it's already there because your ancestors they've already paid a high price for me to be here. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, kind of. Obviously, my views are a bit different, but I do get where you're coming from.
Yeah, because there are people who have a choice. They can leave England if they don't like it, go back to Africa or West Indies. But there are many others who don't have a choice, and so therefore we have to lay a foundations for those that will be remaining here, and try to make, establish the fact that they have a right to be here.
Yeah, but like how obviously black people are still a minority in England,
Hmm.
and like even as however many years we've lived here, if like 100 years in the future, there's still going to be racism. Like, when is it going to become home? How much more work there's got to be put in?
It- Yeah, it's interesting you should say that because a lot of the racism. Thanks for coming. A lot of the racism currently being displayed is out of fear of being taken over. So they say the year 2045 and 2062 are quite significant because it's reckoned by 2045 white people will be in the minority in America, and by 2062 white people will be a minority in England. Now that is putting fear into a lot of people, whereby a lot of the politics we're seeing is people reacting to those statistics and thinking they're going to be removed from history, which I don't think is at all going to be the case. So for me, before we reach those decades, we could put in a lot of work in terms of establishing our shared humanity and start treating each other like human beings first, and then try and find solutions for population issues, if that makes sense. But reacting out of fear is only going to produce tension. We need to be a bit more relaxed, see each other's humanity and communicate with each other and pass that on, that level of humanity to the next generation instead of anxiety and they're taking everything we've got. You took everything we got to begin with, but let's not go there. Let's try and find the middle ground. Yeah, a lot of atrocities have been done, but then they've been done through the ages. What we've got to think about is, are we destroying this planet? Are we passing on a healthy planet to the future generation? To me, that's ultimately, because if we miss that boat and future generations don't have a healthy planet, then we'll have failed, I think. Thanks for your question, yeah.
So I was going to ask as well, do you feel like in a contemporary setting as well, African history is kind of disregarded? Like, I think it was the Second Congo War was the most atrocious war since World War II. Yeah, I didn't hear about it until I looked it up. Yeah, there've been a lot of atrocities, but if you've got 8-year-old, 10-year-olds working in mines to pay off their children's debts today, there are more enslaved people in the world today than there were 200 years ago. And that's hush-hushed. So we don't hear about it. So yeah, these atrocities do continue. It's for wealth. So for me, it's about talks like this. I don't care how many people come. As I said at the beginning, it's about quality, not quantity. So if people are really interested in this and they go and talk to their families, share it with their families, share it with their communities, go on a local community radio station and blah, 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 rah, rah, rah. Say, Africans have been in New Yorkshire 2,000 years, and we spread it that way. Because, look at Equiano. Equiano wrote his story in 1789.
Why am I not on television doing Equiano? No, why isn't a great actor? Frederick Douglass, it was his bicentenary 200 years ago. Sorry, his bicentenary last year, celebrating 200 years of his life. In America, not one so-called African superstar, African-American celebrity, did even a biopic on his life, the most famous African-American man. And that's because they're trapped in this Hollywood mentality of that doesn't include them, but they're just chasing after the little bits. And if you're going to do something racist, like Lucy, make sure that Morgan Freeman or Samuel L. Jackson is in it, and you can say what you want. So the narrative is being manipulated, but then it's up to us, people who see each other as human beings, to promote an alternative. Because the establishment is always going to be the establishment, I think. But we, the people, can change things. We can. Yes, we can. To borrow a phrase. I hope that helps.
Sorry, that just reminded me of something that I just thought would be quite funny to mention. In May, I went to Rwanda, and
Oh, wow.
Yorkshire Tea funded a cricket stadium there.
Yeah.
There's a huge cricket stadium.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed whilst I was in that area of Rwanda was that you couldn't buy Yorkshire tea in the area the actual Yorkshire tea plantations were.
Wow.
Which I thought was, why is it Yorkshire tea if Yorkshire has nothing to do with the tea that's actually being produced by the people?
That's a very interesting point, because people in Ghana who've been picking chocolate for generations have never tasted chocolate. And, Congo has uranium and cobalt and all these incredible minerals that the people working in there don't have mobile phones. But yeah, that's Africa. Yeah, people don't care about. But Yorkshire Tea have a good relationship with Rwanda, from what I can see. That's where they get their tea. And they seem to develop a lot of reciprocation, which is quite good. I think it's quite unique, something to be encouraged. Not all multinational companies have that approach. But yeah, I wish I could go to Rwanda. You had a good time?
Oh, it was awesome,
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Yes?
You said that you were an actor historian, and you mentioned West Yorkshire Playhouse, obviously now Leeds Playhouse. Something that gives me real hope, Joe, is some of the work that's being produced there in recent years, and it's found its own legs. It's gone on from there. One in particular was Black Man Walking. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes.
But the fact that it's still touring today, and that's now
Yes.
3 years on.
Yes. I was one of the consultants, very proudly, he said,
Yeah.
on that. And I'd been dying for something like that. Sadly, the Playhouse has its history of kind of going the other way, shall we say. And there was a very sad part for me. And then in terms of appropriation, because the accusations were flying, they got Lenny Henry in to play Othello, and then nothing happened after that for a while. But, Lenny Henry was used as a,
It's a Northern Broadside, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. But I want more development. I want more acknowledgement of narratives of African origin, because the people need to know, not because I want, but I think everybody needs to know. So when I did Runaway Diamonds, it was done in 2005. It was brought back again in 2007. And then nothing happened again after that for another 4 or 5 years. And you're going, it needs to be a development. We need to develop those strong voices. But, when I was doing Black Arts Weeks at the West Yorkshire Playhouse in the 90s, some subscribers were saying, oh, black people are taking over the Playhouse. And it was because they weren't used to seeing black. It was just 1 week in the year, and we were taking over, and they wrote letters to their MPs. And
It's changed since James has arrived, hasn't it?
it has, yeah, the spirit has changed.
Going the right direction.
I hope so. I'm still looking, but I hope so.
Pauline as well, Pauline Mayers. What
Pauline
I
Mayers.
told you.
Yeah. Oh, that was amazing.
Deja did the Q&A after.
Yeah.
Powerful piece, that.
That was amazing. Yeah. But again, it's continuity. because what's Pauline done since? And it's as a professional, it's about your practice and being able to, and heighten your skills. So I'd like to see things really, really develop. But if you're not represented in the arts, then neither is your humanity. And so then people can say whatever they like about you because there's nothing to contradict it. And so that's why I firmly believe in the arts and media and representation so that we can build our perceptions and understanding of each other as human beings. So that goes across all cultures. You know, we're in a great multicultural society and we could learn so much about each other.
The narrative that you give is fabulous and comes from your acting pedigree.
Yeah,
Being an actor. It's great. Thank you.
yeah, thank you very much. But thank you all very much. Thanks for your questions, and I'll hang around for lunch if anybody wants to ask any more. But well done, thank you. Nice one.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, man.